Ty natáčíš video?
Jo.
To výborný. Pizza.
If we were to take our hydrosphere, namely the total mass of the water that exists on the planet, then believe it or not, the world's oceans form more than 97% of that mass, and the tiny remaining 2.77% is freshwater, meaning that potentially, I emphasize, it can be used as a resource. And if we took that 2.77% as our 100% of freshwater, then approximately 77 to 78% of that freshwater is composed of what? What would you say? Mainly the continental glaciers such as the Antarctic and so on. The remaining approximately 21.22%, let's say, is groundwater, and soil moisture forms 0.8% of freshwater. That's paradoxically approximately 50 times more water in soil than in watercourses.
I've been involved in permaculture and gardens for a relatively long time, and it's only in the last few years that I have begun to realize what a great and important thing it is. Because in fact, we have everything from soil. Soil influences what kind of water we'll have in our well. Soil influences whether or not we eat. Soil influences whether we'll have a microclimate within which it's possible to function, or whether we will simply fry in the sun. Besides the fact that it contains some inorganic compounds, such as bedrock, which flakes off, and air, which incidentally has a different composition than atmospheric air, since it contains more carbon dioxide, there is naturally also water. The soil ecosystem is an enormous realm which we don't see much of. It's a network of relationships. But at the beginning of this network are simple bacteria, which function in a certain way. They have the property that when there are unfavorable conditions, they produce spores, release their water, enclose themselves in a kind of hard casing, and wait until the conditions improve. Over the course of time, they are joined by fungi and other microorganisms, such as protozoa, threadworms, small arthropods. Don't turn the soil, since by doing so, you expose the entire ecosystem to solar radiation and climatic conditions. Regardless of the fact that it's layered in millimeters, and those organisms are specialized specifically for the layer in which they live. So when you turn the soil, you put those that are used to being below on top, and vice versa, with the result that they die. Another thing is that they don't just grow better, because fungi, for example, can extend several meters, in some places even kilometers. Fungi are the largest organisms on the planet. For example, somewhere in Oregon, there's a fungus with a length of 300 kilometers, and it's a single organism. Fungi are able to extend a long way and transport nutrients as well as water to a plant. When you have a good ecosystem, then everything's far more resistant to any kind of fluctuations that might occur. So we don't rake about in seed beds, meadows, or fields.
Naturally, the reduced retention capacity of the soil is caused by a deficiency of organic matter. And the reason why it galls me all the more as a hydrogeologist is that you use fertilizers and the retention capacity is then so crap, if you'll excuse my language. And then what happens with the residues of the fertilizers that aren't used up? They get flushed away onto the surface of the groundwater. Look at the shallow sources of groundwater in the Czech Republic today. All of them have a problem with nitrates. If we're to define biochar, biocoal, you can see it's a solid material obtained from the thermal decomposition of biomass within an environment with a limited oxygen supply. And that's what pyrolysis is. And in what way are its properties unique? Thanks to its properties, It could be a suitable way of facing up to global challenges, such as drought and soil erosion. Why? Because charcoal is an organic substance, and as we've said, a deficiency of organic matter means reduced retention capacity. And now I can tell you that the biochar you have in your hand has a surface area of something like 600 square meters per gram. That means that it's capable of holding, and I don't want to exaggerate, but something like 10 times the amount of water in relation to its volume. This is soil. The red is the soil, and that green line is where we added the biochar. Can you see the shift in retention, in the amount of water retained? It's increased in the presence of biochar, but here you can see that it seems to be returning to its original state, meaning that it's holding the water. And then when it comes to the crunch, so to speak, then it'll just say, "Here you are, I've held it for you, that's your lot."
What do we actually achieve by composting and adding compost to the soil? If you look at how much soil has degraded from something that was a full organic substance, that means full carbonaceous compounds, to dust, and all of those carbonaceous compounds were blown into the air in the form of CO2. I read somewhere that we have now lost agricultural land approximately the size of India. So, by composting, we actually create something that is targeted at enriching the soil ecosystem. In fact, I looked at it like two main types of compost. Compost that will be used for herbs, meaning for vegetable gardens, where you'd plant flowers of any kind. That's one type. And the second type of compost will be used for wood plants. In the case of the vegetable compost, we want it to contain the maximum amount of bacteria, as many different types of bacteria as possible. Vegetables love what we call hot compost. We divide the things we compost into two groups of materials. One group is brown stuff, and the other group is made up of green stuff. So, on any land you're looking after, I hope it's clear to you that you're actually cultivating soil. You're not cultivating plants, but above all, you're cultivating soil. And the happier and more content your soil is, the happier and more content your plants are. And in my view, this is made possible by a number of changes. For example, technological development and changes in our cultural and political imagination that these technologies generate. It's undoubtedly connected with the development of neuroplasticity, research into neuroplasticity. It's all closely interconnected. That experience with the internet enables you to imagine the mycelium. I think that platform capitalism, the fact that we know that Airbnb and Uber, Microsoft and Google exist, in my opinion also has an influence on how people are so much into fungi, because they have this experience.
In fact, Malibu says that neuroplasticity has its ideological counterpart, or ideological form, namely flexibility. She actually says that it's an ideological counterpart of the capitalist ideology. In fact, it's the same thing, although in the case of flexibility, this neuroplasticity serves capital, whereas it ought to serve us.
So, for example, Paul Stamets, you might have heard of. He's a famous mycologist who Jonas spoke about yesterday. Paul Stamets has a TED Talk and also a book in which he states that there are 6 ways that fungi can save the world. So, in fact, this interconnection of these fungi, this world, and above all the future of this world, is extremely strong there. Ask the questions. Who are these fungi therefore meant to save? Who will be saved? And from whom or what? And what stories can be heard about these fungi? And what stories can be heard? What interests me is how, for example, national identity is formed via this relationship to fungi, or gender, or racial politics and racism, how they function on the basis of a relationship to fungi. What I'd like to do with these fungi is to think up ways of relating to the place I'm from, and to the people who come from the same place as me. And we share something together, by means other than these ones. But the fungal economy requires the negotiation of shared knowledge, including concealing it or providing misleading information in the interest of one's own prosperity. Negotiation and forming of advantageous alliances, symbiotic links, while at the same time denying certain resources to those with whom it's not advantageous to establish cooperation for that particular person. Because this type of negotiation is in some ways an extension of the way the dynamic between fungi and tree roots takes place. Mycorrhiza is written about like a forest internet, in which an exchange of information and nutrients takes place between fungi and trees. Which is true, but this information and nutritional economy covers not only cooperation and sharing, but also negotiation of organisms. And in many respects, it's similar to the business practices of woods. Because although fungi distribute nutrition and information, for example about attacks from insects, for this service they require, for example, sugar or other carbohydrates which trees provide them with. And fungi here require up to a third of the entire production. Furthermore, they manipulate the tree roots, deflect bacteria and other fungi, which might be interpreted as protecting the trees, and indeed it does protect the trees, but at the same time it's a protection of their own territory.
Nonetheless, today's regime, or today's paradigm, which the Italian philosopher Luciana Parisi refers to as the interactive paradigm, inevitably leads to emergent phenomena. There are starlings that fly, 1 starling, 2, 3, and suddenly you've got a whole flock of them, and suddenly they behave in a certain way during flight. That's an emergent phenomenon, a quality that isn't within individual starlings, but emerges only in that combination. And similarly, the capacity for thought emerges with the complexity of computation processes. The deficit of artificial intelligence is that although it's absolutely perfect in one realm, it can't be transferred elsewhere. In other words, cogitation is always embodied. When we use different thinking hardware, then the thinking will be different. And what interests me about it is that this blend of excellence and deficits or handicaps reminds us of autism. In any case, autism, and this is actually the perspective of so-called neurodiversity, can't be understood only in terms of deficits. It's not only a handicap. Autistic people make a certain social contribution in that they notice things that other people don't. They often have a good memory, and they have a strong need for routine. There are companies that exclusively seek to employ autistic people, not for reasons of charity, but because they help analyze data. For example, it's typical for autistic people to be sought out by the secret services, MI6 or the CIA, because they're capable of finding patterns in that data that other people can't see anywhere. So, where's the similarity with artificial intelligence? In part, besides the fact that both demonstrate the inseparability of thinking from the platform on which it takes place, they are similar precisely in the fact that they excel in one narrow specialism, where others are incompetent. What strikes me as fascinating about it is that it's precisely via this technique, again and again, in the next round, that we learn more about the person, and the person thereby becomes someone new. We become someone new by incorporating people we'd previously excluded from society. That's neurodiversity, and similarly to biodiversity, it serves to empower society. In fact, it's a certain resource which society can draw upon.